I was standing in my backyard in Asheville, North Carolina, watching my bees work their afternoon shift when I heard the screech that would change everything. The sound came from beyond my fence, a noise so piercing it could have shattered glass, and I knew immediately that someone had discovered my hives. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I had been keeping bees in my suburban backyard for 3 years without incident, maintaining 6 healthy colonies that produced some of the best honey in Buncombe County. What I didn't know that Thursday afternoon in late April was that my peaceful hobby was about to become a battleground with the most determined HOA president I had ever encountered. "Excuse me. Excuse me." The voice belonged to a woman who sounded like she gargled gravel and complaints for breakfast. I walked around the side of my house to find a blonde woman in her mid-50s standing at my front door, her finger already pressed against my doorbell like she was trying to drill through it. She wore a white pantsuit that looked expensive and impractical, and her face had that particular shade of red that suggested either high blood pressure or chronic anger. Probably both. "Can I help you?" I asked, wiping my hands on my jeans. I had been inspecting the hives, checking for signs of varroa mites and ensuring the queens were laying properly. My hands still smelled faintly of smoke from the bee smoker. She whirled around, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "Are you Marcus Thompson, the resident of 428 Maple Grove Drive?" "That's me, and you are?" "I am Patricia Henderson, president of the Maple Grove Estates Homeowners Association, and I am here to inform you that you are in direct violation of Section 14.7 of our community guidelines." She thrust a clipboard at me like it was a weapon. "You have illegal livestock on the property." I blinked at her. "Livestock? I don't have any livestock." "The bees, Mr. Thompson, the bees." She said it like I had been hiding elephants in my garage. "A concerned neighbor reported seeing multiple beehives in your backyard, which constitutes a clear and present danger to the community." "Those are honeybees," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "They're not livestock, they're beneficial insects." "I'm a licensed apiary inspector with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. I know what I'm doing." Patricia's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked more determined. "I don't care if you're the bee whisperer himself." Section 14.7 clearly states that no resident may keep livestock, poultry, or dangerous animals on their property without express written permission from the HOA board. Bees are dangerous. They sting. They swarm. They pose a liability risk. Honeybees are actually quite docile when properly managed, I explained, slipping into the educational tone I used when teaching beekeeping classes at the local community center. "They only sting when they feel threatened, and my hives are positioned in a way that—" "I don't need a lecture, Mr. Thompson, I need compliance." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my house, my yard, everything she could see from the street. "You have 48 hours to remove those hives from the property, or the HOA will be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" I asked, feeling the first stirrings of real concern. "Daily fines of $100 until compliance is achieved, and if you continue to refuse, we have the authority to enter your property and remove the offending items ourselves." She smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I suggest you make arrangements with a beekeeper in a more appropriate location. Perhaps somewhere rural, where your hobby won't endanger innocent families." She turned on her heel and marched back to her silver Mercedes SUV, leaving me standing on my front lawn with my mouth hanging open. I had dealt with difficult people before, but Patricia Henderson was something else entirely. She had the kind of confidence that came from years of getting her way through sheer force of will and threats of legal action. I went back inside and pulled out my HOA documents, which I hadn't looked at since I bought the house 5 years ago. I flipped through the pages until I found Section 14.7. Sure enough, there it was. "No resident shall keep livestock, poultry, or other farm animals on the property without written permission from the HOA board." But there was nothing specifically about bees. The language was vague enough that someone could interpret it either way, which meant this was going to get ugly. I called my friend Derek, who was a real estate attorney in Charlotte. We had gone to NC State together, and he had helped me with the paperwork when I bought the house. He listened to my story and then let out a low whistle. Man, HOAs are the worst. But here's the thing, legally, bees aren't classified as livestock in North Carolina. They're considered agricultural insects. You should be protected under the state's right to farm laws, especially since you're licensed. So I can tell Patricia to pound sand. Well, yes and no, you can fight this, but it's going to be a pain. HOAs have a lot of power, and they can make your life miserable even if they're technically in the wrong. You might want to try reasoning with the board first, show them your credentials. Explain the benefits of having pollinators in the neighborhood. I thanked Derek and hung up, feeling slightly better but still annoyed. I spent the rest of the evening preparing a presentation for the HOA board. I printed out my apiary inspector license, documentation from the state agricultural department, studies on the importance of honeybees for local ecosystems, and testimonials from my beekeeping students. I even included photos of my hives, showing how well-maintained they were and how they were positioned to minimize any interaction with neighbors. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice stapled to my front door. It was an official HOA violation notice, complete with property photos, violation codes, and a deadline. 48 hours to remove the hives, starting from yesterday. I had less than 24 hours left. I called the HOA office and asked to schedule an emergency meeting with the board. The secretary, a tired-sounding woman named Margaret, told me the next board meeting wasn't until the following month. I don't have a month, I said. Patricia Henderson gave me 48 hours to remove my beehives, and I need to present my case to the board before that deadline. Margaret sighed. Mr. Thompson, I can pass along your request, but Mrs. Henderson has the authority to issue violation notices without board approval. If you want to appeal, you'll need to submit a written request and wait for the next meeting. That doesn't make any sense. How can she enforce a deadline that expires before I have a chance to appeal? I'm sorry, sir. I don't make the rules. I hung up and immediately started drafting a formal appeal letter. I sent it via email and certified mail, making sure I had documentation of everything. Then I called the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and spoke with my supervisor, a gruff but fair man named Bill Patterson who had been inspecting apiaries for 30 years. Bill, I've got an HOA trying to shut down my home apiary. Can they do that, legally? No. Bees aren't livestock and you're licensed and registered with the state. But that doesn't mean they won't try. I've seen this before. Some HOAs think they're above state law. He paused. You want me to send them a letter explaining the legal situation? That would be amazing. Give me their contact info. I'll draft something official this afternoon. But Marcus, be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. People like that don't like being told they're wrong. Bill wasn't kidding. That evening, I received a call from my next-door neighbor, Janet Wu, who sounded anxious. Marcus, I just wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia has been going door to door, telling everyone that your bees are dangerous and that you're putting children at risk. She's trying to get people to sign a petition to force you out. That's ridiculous. My bees have never bothered anyone. I know, and I told her that. I like watching them in my garden. They're good for my tomatoes. But she's really working people up. She told the Johnsons that their daughter could die from a bee sting because she has allergies. Does their daughter actually have bee allergies? Not that I know of. I think Patricia is just making stuff up. I thanked Janet and tried to stay calm, but I could feel the situation spiraling out of control. Patricia wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, she was waging a campaign against me personally. I needed to figure out why and fast. The 48-hour deadline came and went. I didn't remove my hives. I had spent too much time and money building my apiary, and I wasn't going to let someone with a clipboard and a power trip destroy it based on a misinterpretation of HOA guidelines. I knew I was taking a risk, but I also knew I was legally in the right. On Saturday morning, I was having coffee on my back deck when I heard the sound of vehicles pulling up in front of my house. I walked around to the front yard and stopped dead. There were 3 trucks parked in my driveway. Patricia's Mercedes, a white pickup with Maple Grove Estates HOA printed on the side, and a commercial pest control van. Patricia stood in the middle of my lawn like a general surveying a battlefield, directing 2 men in coveralls who were unloading equipment. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice coming out louder than I intended. Patricia turned to me with a satisfied smile. "Mr. Thompson, you failed to comply with the violation notice. As stated in the HOA guidelines, we now have the right to enter your property and remedy the situation ourselves. These gentlemen are licensed pest control specialists, and they'll be removing and disposing of your illegal beehives." "Like hell they will." I stepped between the pest control workers and my backyard gate. "You don't have my permission to enter my property, and if you try, I'll call the police." "We don't need your permission," Patricia said, pulling out a document. Section 23.2 grants the HOA access to any property in order to remedy violations that pose a health or safety risk. Your bees qualify. One of the pest control workers, a young guy with a nervous expression, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm not sure about this." "If he's saying we can't enter, you're being paid to do a job," Patricia snapped. "Do it." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I need to report a trespassing in progress." That got everyone's attention. Patricia's face went from satisfied to furious in about half a second. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. You don't have the right to enter my property without my consent, HOA agreement or not. State law supersedes HOA rules, and what you're trying to do is theft and destruction of property." The dispatcher answered, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. She told me to stay on the line and that officers were being dispatched. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but even she seemed to realize that forcing her way onto my property with the police on the way was a bad idea. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But this isn't over. The HOA will be filing a lawsuit against you for violation of community guidelines, and you'll be responsible for all legal fees. I hope your little bee hobby is worth it." The pest control workers packed up their equipment and left, followed by Patricia. I stayed outside until 2 Asheville police officers arrived about 10 minutes later. I explained the situation again, showing them the violation notice, my apiary license, and the documentation from the state agriculture department. The officers, a middle-aged woman named Officer Torres and a younger man named Officer Chen, listened carefully and took notes. "So she was trying to remove your bees without your permission?" Officer Torres asked. "That's right. She claims the HOA agreement gives her the authority, but my attorney says she's wrong." Officer Chen looked over the documents. "These bees, are they dangerous, like Africanized honeybees or something?" "No, they're standard European honeybees, completely docile." "I'm a licensed apiary inspector, which means I'm certified by the state to inspect and manage bee colonies. I teach beekeeping classes. I know what I'm doing." Officer Torres nodded. "Okay, well, here's the thing. This is really a civil matter between you and your HOA. We can't stop them from fining you or taking legal action. But what we can tell you is that they can't force entry onto your property to remove things without either your permission or a court order. If they try again, call us and we'll cite them for trespassing." "What about the threats?" "She's been going around the neighborhood telling people my bees are dangerous, trying to turn everyone against me." "That's not illegal unless she's doing something that rises to the level of harassment or defamation. If you think it's gotten that bad, you could file a civil suit, but again, that's not really a police matter." I thanked the officers and went back inside, feeling frustrated. The police were right. This was a civil issue which meant lawyers and court dates and thousands of dollars in legal fees. But I wasn't going to back down. Patricia had crossed a line by trying to confiscate my hives, and I was going to make sure she faced consequences. Over the next few days, I received daily violation notices in the mail, each one adding another $100 to my supposed fines. I also received a formal notice that the HOA was filing a lawsuit against me for willful violation of community standards and failure to comply with board directives. The lawsuit demanded removal of the beehives, payment of all accumulated fines, and reimbursement of the HOA's legal fees. I hired Derek to represent me, and we started building my defense. Derek was confident we could win, but he warned me that HOA cases could drag on for months or even years, and that Patricia seemed like the type who would fight to the bitter end. "She's got something personal against you," Derek said during one of our strategy meetings. "This level of aggression isn't normal even for power-hungry HOA presidents." Any idea what triggered this? I thought about it. Not really. I've never even met her before she showed up at my door. I keep to myself, pay my HOA dues on time, maintain my property. I can't think of anything I've done to piss her off. Well, something set her off. Maybe ask around, see if anyone knows why she's so fixated on your bees. I took Derek's advice and started talking to my neighbors. Most of them were sympathetic to my situation. Janet Wu told me that Patricia had tried to fine her for having wind chimes that were supposedly too loud. The Johnsons said Patricia had threatened to tow their teenage son's car because it was parked on the street overnight, which technically violated HOA rules, but was something everyone did occasionally. The more I talked to people, the more I realized that Patricia had a reputation for being unreasonably strict and vindictive. But it was my neighbor across the street, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who gave me the real answer. Frank had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, long before it became part of an HOA, and he had no love for Patricia Henderson. "You want to know why she's after you?" Frank said, sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea. "It's because of what happened with her son." Her son. "Yeah, kid named Brandon. He was about 25, maybe 26. About 4 years ago, he got stung by a bee at some outdoor event, had a severe allergic reaction, nearly died. Ever since then, Patricia has been absolutely paranoid about bees. She sees them as these deadly creatures that need to be eliminated wherever they appear." That explained a lot. I actually felt a twinge of sympathy for Patricia, understanding now that her crusade against my hives came from a place of trauma and fear rather than pure malice. But that didn't make her actions any more acceptable. She was letting her personal fears override common sense and the law. The lawsuit moved forward. Derek filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA lacked standing to regulate my beekeeping activities because state law explicitly protected agricultural operations, including apiaries. We also filed a counterclaim for harassment, emotional distress, and attorney's fees. Patricia, through the HOA's lawyer, responded with an amended complaint that included additional accusations. That I was operating a commercial business from my residential property, that my bees were creating a nuisance by swarming into neighbors' yards, and that I had been uncooperative and threatening toward HOA representatives. None of these accusations were true. My beekeeping was purely a hobby. I occasionally sold honey at farmers' markets, but that was well within the bounds of home agricultural use. My bees had never swarmed into anyone's yard because I was vigilant about swarm prevention and management. And the only time I had been threatening was when I called the police to prevent Patricia from trespassing on my property. The case was assigned to Judge Margaret Whitfield in Buncombe County Superior Court. Our first hearing was scheduled for mid-June, about 6 weeks after Patricia had first appeared at my door. In the meantime, life got increasingly difficult. The HOA continued sending daily violation notices, and my supposed fines climbed to over $5,000. Patricia sent out a newsletter to all Maple Grove Estates residents warning them about the dangerous bee situation and encouraging them to report any bee sightings to the HOA immediately. Some of my neighbors started avoiding me. The Johnsons stopped waving when I saw them outside. A family 2 streets over complained to the HOA that they had seen a bee in their yard and blamed my hives, even though honeybees regularly forage up to 3 miles from their hive, and there were multiple wild colonies in the area. The constant negativity and accusations were exhausting. But I also had supporters. Janet Wu organized a petition in support of my beekeeping, which was signed by about 40% of the neighborhood. Frank Morrison wrote a letter to the HOA board criticizing Patricia's handling of the situation and calling for her removal as president. And my beekeeping students showed up to help me maintain the hives, making sure they were in perfect condition for whatever inspections or legal proceedings might come. The first court hearing was mostly procedural. Judge Whitfield listened to both sides present their arguments, asked a few clarifying questions, and then scheduled a full hearing for July. She denied the HOA's request for a preliminary injunction that would have forced me to remove the hives immediately, which I took as a good sign. As we left the courthouse, Patricia cornered me in the parking lot. She was alone this time, without her lawyer or any HOA board members. "You think you're so smart," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You think you can just ignore the rules and do whatever you want." "I'm following state law," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm sorry about what happened to your son, but my bees aren't dangerous. They're essential pollinators and I manage them responsibly." Her face went pale. "Who told you about Brandon? Does it matter?" "The point is, I understand why you're afraid of bees, but your fear doesn't give you the right to destroy my property or harass me." "Harass you? You're the one who called the police on me, because you were trying to trespass and steal my beehives. What did you expect me to do?" She stepped closer, and for a moment, I thought she might actually take a swing at me. "I expect you to care about the safety of your neighbors. I expect you to understand that not everyone wants to live next to someone who keeps thousands of stinging insects. But clearly, you're too selfish to see that. And you're too scared to admit that you're wrong," I shot back. "Bees aren't the enemy, Patricia. They're necessary for our food system, our environment, everything. Your son's allergy is tragic, but it doesn't mean all bees need to be eliminated." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, her shoulders rigid with anger. I watched her go, feeling both frustrated and sad. This whole situation was spiraling into something ugly, and I didn't see an easy way out. June turned into July, and the temperature climbed into the 90s. My bees were thriving, producing honey at an impressive rate. I spent my evenings extracting honey and bottling it, finding peace in the rhythmic work. The legal battle loomed over everything, but in my backyard, surrounded by the gentle hum of thousands of bees, I could almost forget about it. The full hearing was scheduled for July 15th. Derek and I spent days preparing, organizing our evidence and rehearsing my testimony. We had documentation from the state agriculture department, letters of support from local beekeeping associations, expert testimony from Bill Patterson, and photos showing the excellent condition of my hives. We also had evidence of Patricia's campaign against me, the newsletters, the door-to-door petition, the testimony of neighbors who had been pressured to sign complaints. On the morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit and drove to the courthouse with Derek. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Patricia was there with the HOA's lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s named Michelle Crawford. Several HOA board members were present, along with a handful of neighbors who I assumed were there to testify against me. But I also saw friendly faces: Janet Wu, Frank Morrison, and 3 of my beekeeping students. Judge Whitfield called the hearing to order, and Michelle Crawford stood to present the HOA's case. She argued that my beekeeping violated the clear language of the HOA agreement, that I had been uncooperative and hostile toward legitimate HOA enforcement efforts, and that my bees posed a genuine safety risk to the community, particularly to residents with allergies. She called Patricia as her first witness. Patricia took the stand and testified about the day she discovered my hives, describing her shock and concern. She talked about her son's near-fatal allergic reaction, her voice breaking with emotion as she recounted the terror of watching him struggle to breathe in the emergency room. "I just want to keep people safe," Patricia said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I don't understand why Mr. Thompson won't just move his bees somewhere else, somewhere they won't put families at risk." Michelle then called several neighbors who testified about seeing bees in their yards, expressing concern about children playing outside and describing the stress of living near an apiary. One woman claimed her daughter had been stung while playing in their backyard, though when Derek cross-examined her, she admitted she hadn't actually seen the bee and couldn't confirm it had come from my hives. When it was our turn, Derek called me to the stand. I testified about my background in beekeeping, my state license and certification as an apiary inspector, and the care I took in managing my colonies. I explained that honeybees are gentle creatures that only sting when defending their hive, and that my hives were positioned and managed to minimize any interaction with neighbors. I talked about the importance of pollinators for local gardens and agriculture, and how my bees actually benefited the entire neighborhood by improving crop yields and flower production. Derek entered my apiary inspector license into evidence, along with my registration with the State Agriculture Department and documentation showing regular inspections and compliance with all state regulations. Then he called Bill Patterson as an expert witness. Bill was perfect on the stand. He had decades of experience, a no-nonsense demeanor, and the kind of credibility that comes from years of public service. He testified that my apiary was one of the best-maintained home operations he had ever inspected, that my bees posed minimal risk to the community, and that North Carolina law explicitly protected beekeeping as an agricultural activity that could not be prohibited by HOAs. "Bees are not livestock," Bill said firmly. "They're not pets. They're agricultural insects, and they're protected under state right to farm statutes. An HOA cannot ban beekeeping any more than they could ban someone from growing tomatoes in their backyard." Michelle tried to poke holes in his testimony during cross-examination, asking about the risks of bee stings and the possibility of Africanized honeybees. But Bill shut down every argument with facts and expertise. By the time he stepped down, I felt confident we had made a strong case. The hearing lasted most of the day. Judge Whitfield listened carefully, took extensive notes, and asked pointed questions of both sides. When testimony concluded, she announced that she would issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were agonizing. I tried to stay busy, teaching my summer beekeeping classes and tending to my hives, but I couldn't stop thinking about the case. Everything I had worked for hung in the balance. If Judge Whitfield ruled against me, I would be forced to remove my hives or face escalating fines and legal consequences. If she ruled in my favor, I would be vindicated, but I would still have to live in a neighborhood where a significant number of people saw me as a threat. The ruling came on July 28th, delivered via email and certified mail. Derek called me as soon as he received his copy. "We won," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Complete victory. Read it." I opened the PDF with shaking hands and started reading. Judge Whitfield's ruling was thorough and unambiguous. She found that honeybees were not livestock under North Carolina law, that beekeeping was an agricultural activity protected by state right to farm statutes, and that the HOA's attempt to ban or regulate my apiary was preempted by state law. She dismissed the HOA's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile. She also found that the HOA had acted in bad faith by attempting to confiscate my hives without legal authority, and she ordered the HOA to pay my attorney's fees and court costs. But the ruling went even further. Judge Whitfield found that Patricia Henderson had engaged in harassment by conducting a neighborhood campaign to pressure me into compliance, and she issued an order prohibiting the HOA from taking any further action against me related to my beekeeping activities. Any violation of this order could result in contempt charges. I called Derek back, hardly able to contain my excitement. "This is amazing. This is better than I hoped." "She really stuck it to them," Derek agreed. "That finding of bad faith is huge. It means if they try this again with anyone else, you've got precedent to point to. You might have just made it easier for every beekeeper in North Carolina to fight off their HOA." I celebrated that night with my beekeeping students, grilling burgers in my backyard while my bees hummed peacefully in their hives. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The nightmare was over, but I was wrong. Patricia Henderson wasn't done yet. 2 days after the ruling was issued, I came home from work to find my backyard gate open and 3 of my 6 hives missing. Not damaged, not destroyed, just gone. The hive stands were empty, the equipment vanished. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. Each hive represented hundreds of dollars in equipment and months of work building up the colony. But worse than the financial loss was the loss of the bees themselves, living creatures I had cared for and nurtured. I immediately called the police. Officer Torres responded again, along with a detective named Sarah Mitchell. They took photos, dusted for fingerprints, and interviewed neighbors. No one had seen anything, which wasn't surprising since most people were at work during the day. But Frank Morrison's security camera, which faced the street, had captured something interesting. Patricia's Mercedes SUV parked in front of my house around noon, followed by a white pickup truck that backed into my driveway. "That's theft," Detective Mitchell said, reviewing the footage on Frank's computer. "Clear as day. We can see someone matching Mrs. Henderson's description entering your property, and then the truck leaves with items loaded in the back. Can you estimate the value of what was taken?" I did some quick math. Each hive setup cost about $800 in equipment, plus the value of the bees themselves, maybe $3,000 total, not counting the lost honey production. That's grand larceny. We'll need to bring her in for questioning. Patricia was arrested the next day. According to Derek, who had friends in the district attorney's office, she initially denied everything, claiming she had just been checking to make sure I was complying with HOA standards. But when confronted with the security footage and the fact that 3 hives were missing, she changed her story. She claimed she had hired someone to remove the hives for safety reasons and had planned to store them until I came to my senses. She refused to say where the hives were. I was frantic. Honeybee colonies are delicate ecosystems. Without proper care and placement, the bees could die within days, especially in the summer heat. I called Bill Patterson, and he helped me coordinate with local beekeepers to search for the missing hives. We checked every possible location we could think of, from storage units to abandoned properties. It was one of my students, a young woman named Emily Chen who worked at a local garden center, who finally found them. She had been making deliveries to various properties around Asheville when she noticed 3 beehives sitting behind a storage shed at a commercial property on the outskirts of town. The property belonged to Patricia's brother-in-law, who claimed he had no idea the hives were there and that Patricia must have paid someone to drop them off without his knowledge. The hives were in bad shape. They had been sitting in direct sunlight for 3 days without water or proper ventilation. One colony was completely dead. The other 2 were severely stressed, with significant die-off and the queens missing, likely having absconded due to the terrible conditions. I managed to salvage what I could, combining the survivors into a single hive and introducing a new queen, but it was heartbreaking. The legal consequences for Patricia were severe. She was charged with grand larceny, criminal trespass, and destruction of property. The HOA board, finally understanding the liability they faced, immediately removed her as president and issued a public apology to me. They offered to pay for the replacement of the lost hives and bees, which I accepted. Patricia's case went to trial in September. I testified about the theft and the damage to my colonies. Bill Patterson testified about the value of the bees and the recklessness of moving established hives. Emily testified about finding the hives. And Frank's security footage was played for the jury, showing Patricia directing someone to enter my property and remove the hives. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she had been acting out of genuine concern for public safety and that she hadn't intended to cause harm to the bees. But the prosecution pointed out that she had ignored a court order, committed theft, and caused thousands of dollars in damage out of spite after losing her lawsuit. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Patricia guilty on all counts. Judge Robert Chen, who presided over the criminal trial, sentenced her to 6 months in jail, suspended to probation contingent on her completing 200 hours of community service, paying full restitution to me for the lost hives and bees, and attending anger management counseling. He also issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from coming within 100 yards of my property. Mrs. Henderson, Judge Chen said during sentencing, I understand that you experienced trauma with your son's allergic reaction, and I sympathize with that fear. But your response to that trauma has been to lash out at an innocent person who was following the law and pursuing a legitimate hobby. Your actions were not those of a concerned neighbor. They were vindictive and destructive. I hope you use this probation period to reflect on your behavior and find healthier ways to cope with your fears. The whole ordeal finally came to an end in October, 6 months after Patricia had first shown up at my door. The HOA paid me $12,000 in restitution, covering the cost of replacing my lost hives, the value of the bees, projected honey production losses, and a portion of my attorney's fees. Patricia paid an additional $5,000 in criminal restitution and began her community service, which ironically involved working with a local environmental nonprofit that educated people about the importance of pollinators. The new HOA president, a reasonable guy named Tom Brennan who worked as an accountant, reached out to me personally to apologize and to ask if I would be willing to give a presentation about beekeeping at a neighborhood meeting. I agreed, and in November, I stood in front of about 50 Maple Grove Estates residents and talked about honeybees, their importance to the ecosystem, and how to coexist safely with managed hives. The presentation went better than I expected. People asked thoughtful questions about bee behavior, honey production, and what to do if they encountered a swarm. Several residents apologized for believing Patricia's fear-mongering. Janet Wu announced that she was interested in starting her own small hive, and I offered to mentor her. Even the Johnsons, who had been avoiding me for months, came up afterward to say they appreciated learning the truth about bees. I rebuilt my apiary over the winter, eventually expanding to 8 hives. With support from the new HOA board, I started a neighborhood pollinator garden initiative, working with interested residents to plant bee-friendly flowers and native plants. The project brought the community together in a way that nothing else had, and by the following spring, Maple Grove Estates was buzzing with happy, healthy honeybees and a renewed appreciation for nature. Frank Morrison liked to joke that I had turned Patricia's vendetta into the best thing that ever happened to the neighborhood. In a strange way, he was right. The conflict had forced conversations about HOA overreach, the importance of following laws rather than personal fears, and the value of education over reaction. It had also connected me with neighbors I might never have gotten to know otherwise. Patricia completed her probation and community service. I saw her once from a distance at a farmer's market where I was selling honey. She looked smaller somehow, less formidable. She saw me too, and for a moment our eyes met. Then she turned and walked away. I didn't feel angry. I felt sad for her, trapped by fear and unable to move past her trauma. My beekeeping hobby continued to grow. I expanded my classes at the community center, started mentoring new beekeepers across the region, and became more active in the state beekeeping association. Bill Patterson retired, and I was offered a part-time position as a regional apiary inspector, which I accepted. The job allowed me to help other beekeepers navigate regulations and deal with their own HOA issues, armed with the precedent from my case. Derek and I stayed friends, and he occasionally sent me news articles about similar HOA conflicts around the country. My case had gotten some media attention, and it became a reference point for beekeepers fighting to protect their right to keep hives. Several states even introduced legislation explicitly protecting beekeeping from HOA regulation, citing Judge Whitfield's ruling as inspiration. The neighborhood changed too. The publicity from the trial had brought unwanted attention to Maple Grove Estates, and several board members resigned in embarrassment. Tom Brennan led an effort to rewrite the HOA guidelines, making them more reasonable and explicitly exempting activities protected by state law. The revised guidelines passed with overwhelming support from residents who were tired of the heavy-handed enforcement tactics of the Patricia Henderson era. As for my bees, they thrived. By the second summer after the conflict, my 8 hives were producing over 200 pounds of honey annually. I sold some at farmers markets and local stores, donated some to food banks, and gave a lot away to friends, neighbors, and students. There was something deeply satisfying about sharing the literal fruits of my labor, watching people's faces light up when they tasted real, local honey for the first time. One afternoon in late August, I was doing a hive inspection when Emily, my student who had found the stolen hives, stopped by to check on her own newly established colony that I had helped her set up in her backyard. We stood together in the golden afternoon sun, watching thousands of bees coming and going, each one carrying precious pollen back to the hive. "You know," Emily said, "I never would have gotten into beekeeping if all that crazy stuff with Patricia hadn't happened. I mean, I felt terrible about what you went through, but it also made me realize how important this is. How much we need people willing to stand up for what's right." I smiled. "Well, I'm glad something good came out of it, and you're doing great with your hive. That queen is laying a beautiful pattern. Thanks to your teaching. I still can't believe someone tried to ban this. It's so peaceful, therapeutic even." She was right. Despite everything I had been through, the stress and anger and fear, my time with my bees had always been a refuge. There was something profound about working with creatures that had been doing essentially the same thing for millions of years, following patterns and instincts that predated human civilization. It put everything in perspective. The legal and emotional aftermath of the conflict lasted well into the following year. I gave interviews to beekeeping magazines and local news outlets, always trying to frame the story as a lesson about education and understanding, rather than simply demonizing Patricia or HOAs in general. I believed that most conflicts stemmed from ignorance and fear rather than malice, and that the solution was conversation and knowledge. The HOA's insurance company settled with me out of court for an additional $20,000 to avoid a civil lawsuit for emotional distress and reputational damage. I used the money to fund a scholarship for students interested in studying apiculture at NC State, my alma mater. It seemed like the right way to turn something negative into lasting positive change. Patricia disappeared from the neighborhood shortly after completing her probation. Rumor had it that she moved to Florida to be closer to her son Brandon, who had apparently been mortified by his mother's actions and had cut off contact with her during the legal proceedings. I hoped she found peace and maybe some therapy to help her process her trauma in healthier ways. The experience changed me in unexpected ways. I became more involved in local government, attending city council meetings and speaking out on issues related to urban agriculture and environmental protection. I joined the board of directors for the Regional Beekeeping Association and helped develop educational programs for schools. I even taught a class at the community college on navigating legal and regulatory challenges for small-scale agricultural operations. But the biggest change was internal. Before the conflict with Patricia, I had been content to keep to myself, pursue my hobbies, and avoid confrontation. The experience forced me to stand up for what I believed in, to fight for my rights, and to refuse to be bullied into submission. It taught me that sometimes you have to be willing to go through hell to protect the things you love. Years later, I still keep bees in my backyard in Asheville. My apiary has grown to 12 hives now, and I've become something of a local expert on urban beekeeping. People call me for advice, invite me to speak at events, and seek me out at farmers' markets to talk about honey and pollination, and the miracle of honeybees. The Maple Grove Estates HOA became one of the most bee-friendly communities in North Carolina, with dozens of residents keeping small hives or planting pollinator gardens. We hold an annual Bee Fest every spring, where local beekeepers showcase their operations, sell honey and beeswax products, and teach people about the importance of protecting pollinators. It's become a neighborhood tradition, attracting hundreds of visitors. Janet Wu became an excellent beekeeper, eventually expanding to 4 hives of her own. We often inspect our hives together, sharing tips and stories. Frank Morrison, who passed away peacefully in his sleep at 87, left me a note in his will thanking me for making the neighborhood more interesting in his final years. His security camera footage, he wrote, had been the highlight of his retirement. I still have the framed court ruling hanging in my home office, a reminder of the day Judge Whitfield affirmed my right to keep bees and hold the HOA accountable for their overreach. Next to it is a photo of my original 6 hives, taken on a sunny spring morning before Patricia Henderson entered my life. 3 of those original colonies, or rather their descendants, still produce honey in my backyard today. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the things we love most require us to fight for them. It taught me that fear can make people do terrible things, but education and compassion can overcome that fear. And it taught me that a single person, armed with knowledge and determination, can stand up to institutional power and win. Every time I harvest honey, extracting the golden liquid from the frames while bees hum contentedly in the background, I think about how close I came to losing all of this. How Patricia's fear and the HOA's overreach nearly destroyed something beautiful and important. But I also think about how the conflict ultimately made everything stronger. My commitment to beekeeping, the neighborhood's understanding of pollinators, and the legal protections for beekeepers throughout the state. My bees continue their ancient work, pollinating gardens and producing honey, oblivious to the human drama that once swirled around them. They are a daily reminder that nature persists, that life finds a way, and that sometimes the sweetest victories come from the most bitter conflicts. Patricia Henderson tried to take away my beehives, but in the end, she gave me something more valuable: a purpose, a community, and a story worth telling. The sun sets over my backyard in Asheville, casting long shadows across the hives. Tomorrow I'll teach another class, mentor another new beekeeper, or maybe just sit and watch my bees work their magic. Whatever happens, I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do. And no HOA Karen, no matter how determined, can take that away from me.